Welcome to the TBC podcast, where we talk about curious, thought-provoking, and sometimes controversial ideas through the lens of biblical wisdom. My name is Matthew Heavener. I'm the Vice President of Enrollment Management and Development here at Trinity Baptist College, and I have the privilege today of interviewing Keith Wood, our resident professor of philosophy. Keith, how are you this morning?
I'm doing good. It's always good to be here.
And you're probably in a unique position where you're sitting in the chair that everyone else usually sits in this conversation. You normally do these interviews, but we thought it would be important and practical to also introduce you and explain why we selected you to conduct these interviews. So let's get into it and talk a little bit about Keith Wood. I'm sure just really just looking forward to that, aren't you?
Let's see what happens.
So Keith, you and I met, I believe, in about 2015. I think we were at my parents' house, and I can remember being introduced to you by my younger brother, who had recruited you to come to Trinity Baptist College. And he said, Matt, you got to meet this kid. He is interested in magic, I think, as much or more than you are. And so we were at my parents' house for a small group Bible study, as I remember, and we kind of hit it off. And I can remember when I watched you perform magic tricks, thinking, okay, this guy has practiced. He's taken magic way more seriously than I have, and I remember as a much younger me sitting in front of a mirror and trying to make card tricks look like they were actually magic. It was a tough thing. I don't know that I've ever gotten very good at it, but I watched what you were doing and I said, oh wow, that's somebody that's put in a lot of hours of time and effort. And I think that started a curiosity that I had about you that really has, and I don't think I would say this out of turn at all, but it's truly blossomed into a wonderful friendship that I've had over the last decade now of having known you, and I would count you as one of my closest friends. At the same time, I think I've figured out that your depth is much deeper than magic tricks, and I want to get into that a little bit today about philosophy and things like that. But before we do, tell me a little bit about how you managed to come to Trinity. I mean, what's that journey? How did you get here?
Oh, okay. So I grew up in Germany. I was a missionary kid, and my parents had previously lived in the States. My dad actually attended Trinity for 2 years back in the 1980s. And so Trinity, the church that's affiliated with the college, is my parents' sending church. So they've always had a close relationship with the church, and then obviously with the college as well, seeing as that's where my dad had attended college. So I kind of knew about Trinity. Whenever we would come back to the States, we would normally come and visit Jacksonville and Trinity. So I was aware of Trinity. I'm the youngest of 4 kids, and my 2 older sisters also attended Trinity. So it was definitely always something that was there. How exactly I came to be here is probably a longer story. There were a lot of different influences that played into bringing me to Trinity. But one factor is the pastor of Trinity Baptist Church, Pastor Tom Messer, was doing a singles event, a singles conference in Germany. And he came with his son Michael, and I got to hang out with him a little bit, and it was a really good time. And actually, Michael had some really good conversations with me that kind of, I guess, got the ball rolling in me taking steps to actually like moving to Trinity.
That's cool. And then when you got here, probably the best thing that's happened to you was maybe meeting Nancy. I mean, I'm teeing that up for you because you better say that's the best thing that happened to you. But tell me a little bit about, like, once you were here, kind of not just the academic side of things at Trinity, but also the social side of things. I mean, those really were influential in your life.
Yeah, I would say so. So I met my wife freshman year. A fortunate, I guess, element of being in a place like Trinity is it's small enough that you can pretty much get to know everybody. And so I was able to meet Nancy, and we ended up actually working together and um, dated for quite a while and got married. So yeah, that was definitely a highlight of my experience here.
Yeah, I would definitely say that you should say that. Now the other thing that's interesting about that is you actually you originally were a business management and ethics major, and that's what you graduated with.
Yeah,
So
that's
so
right.
you had a business background, and I can remember you working for the recruiting department, and also I remember working with you on your internship for business. I think you did an internship with where you helped a local condo association obtain financing and get repairs done because it was in kind of a state of neglect. And so, you know, you then went on and you graduated in 2018. You worked at Trinity for about a year, and then you went to get your master's in philosophy from Biola
Yeah,
University.
that's right.
So I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about philosophy. I mean, I think philosophy is fascinating, and I would argue it's probably one of the most practical things that a person can study because it's how to think. But in addition to that, I know there were other things that affected your interest in philosophy, and I'd like you to kind of talk about that. And particularly, I'm thinking about the whole topic of abortion and how that was influential in you being interested in philosophy as a discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, I think there are two related sort of streams that brought me to studying philosophy. One of them was just kind of an interest in apologetics broadly. I grew up in a missionary home. I was in church all the time, and I think it's kind of natural when you grow up in that environment that you start to form questions about, what do you believe and why do you believe it? And so I had an apologetic interest, and my dad introduced me to some good books when I was younger. And then while I was attending Trinity, you in addition to studying my business curriculum, I was taking Bible classes
Mm-hmm.
just as a part of being a Trinity student. And so I definitely had this theological apologetic interest, and that was fostered by some of the professors here and some of the events, groups that we had going on around campus. And that definitely pushed me in kind of a philosophical direction. I noticed that I just personally kind of gravitated more toward the philosophical questions than the theological questions and those kinds of conversations. So that's one stream of, I guess, I would say influence.
Before we leave that, because I think that's
Mhm.
interesting, what would you say the difference between those two areas of study are for you? Like, how would you delineate? I'm studying because it's an ongoing joke. You always say I'm not a theologian, and I would counter back that all men are theologians, but and you do have a delineation between what you say. Okay, I'm practicing philosophy here, and this is theology, and there's a difference between the two.
There is a difference between the two, but it's not necessarily a stark contrast. The lines get blurry,
They
I guess I
complement each
would say.
other.
They
Yeah.
complement each other, and it's not always entirely clear whether you're doing philosophy or theology. So there are subjects called philosophical theology, for example,
Hmm.
where you're really bringing philosophical tools to theological discussions. Um, I guess maybe like an inaccurate but helpfully inaccurate way to define these would be to say that philosophy deals with natural revelation or general revelation, and tries to reason merely from the deliverances of general revelation. So looking at
Hmm.
nature and thinking carefully about the things that nature reveals to you and asking questions. Whereas theology, which literally means the study of God,
Hmm.
is tends to deal more with special revelation. Now, there are fields like natural theology where you try to do theology from general revelation. So again, it's not going to be
Sure.
a perfectly stark contrast. And then you can apply philosophical reasoning to the deliverances of special revelation as well. But maybe as a first pass, that's
That's a
an
useful
answer.
distinction. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
And then you were getting ready to talk about the other. So that part of it was of interest to you,
yeah.
and I'm going to use a word that you may not use, but it definitely, I've seen in your life, it's equipped you with a toolbox that allows you to come at theological or non-theological questions in a way that is thoughtful and thoroughly thoughtful. It's not just you think about something; you actually have a process by which you're approaching a
I
problem.
hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that's true. I like to think that's true. Um, so that kind of theological and apologetic interest was one avenue that brought me to the place where I wanted to study philosophy. The other one, as you mentioned, was more on the social ethical side, particularly with the issue of abortion. And I grew up in a home that definitely cared a lot about the abortion issue. My dad was actually he was on the board of a crisis pregnancy center for many
Mm.
many years. In fact, I think he's still on that board. So for really decades. So I definitely grew up being exposed to the abortion issue and hearing conversations about it. Um, so it was in the back of my mind, but I had a really pivotal moment, which was actually visiting a concentration camp. So I had been to several concentration camps growing up, but my dad and I went with some missionaries to a place called Flossenburg, which is actually where Dietrich Bonhoeffer was put
Hmm.
to death, if you're familiar with his story. And I had a moment as I was standing in the middle of this concentration camp where I looked at the walls, and right on the other side of the walls were houses
Mm.
that I could see from inside the camp. Now, I don't know if those houses were there when the camp was there, but um, I was really impressed with this feeling that, wow, this town is so close to this concentration camp. How in the world could people live that close to the kind of atrocities that are going on
Mm.
here, um, and and that not phase them? And as I thought through that, it occurred to me that, wow, well, if what we're saying about the pro-life position about abortion is true, and that when an abortion happens, it really is a human being whose life is being taken, an innocent human being, um, then there's no difference between what happened with these people living next to a concentration camp and us walking past a Planned Parenthood or some
Hmm.
other abortion facility, um, and not paying it a moment's thought. So that for me was a very impactful moment, and it really made me start questioning. Well, like, is this really? I'm not living like this is a true position.
Mm.
So, should I reevaluate this? Let me start doing some studying on that. And so that led me into some philosophical inquiry as well.
Well, and I think the whole notion of, I mean, there is just a tremendous amount of literature written on uh, that particular issue of the Holocaust and how that was able to happen. It was shocking just to the conscience of humanity when suddenly it was uncovered. And I think that there's probably a wealth of information that you can look at in terms of the problem of evil and issues like that philosophy is just constantly grappling with. So I can see where that would have been extremely helpful to be able to apply a system of study to how that works. I think that it's important to note, from my perspective, when I haven't ever heard you explain that before. It makes complete sense to me, and but the thing that was always impressive to me was that I knew you had a commitment um, to creating a contrary perspective towards abortion. I mean, that you were definitely, active in the way that you explained it. But I also was always impressed that you also had a commitment to life, in that you were interested in fostering. I mean, we've even had some funny conversations where it's like people just assume that you and Nancy couldn't have children, which you do. You have a little girl named Verity, and but they assume that because you were fostering,
Right.
there was some sort of an inability for you to have your own children. And I think that knowing you the way that I do, the fact that you put legs to the the thoughts and said, no, I need to help out on this. And I know with Maya and just you've had it's a difficult thing to sit there and to foster. I mean, I think that that's a thing where you become very attached to a child that you may not have forever, but I know that some of the basis of that is in the appreciation of human life, and that desire to see other human beings flourish. And is it fair to say that the introduction to fostering came out of the relationships that you were putting together in addressing abortion?
I would definitely say that there was a connection in my thinking. I mean, when you have conversations with people about abortion, particularly like antagonistic conversations, like debate type
Mm-hmm.
conversations, there's a very common sort of statement that if you cared about kids, really you would care for fostering or whatever. Um, and really, that's a bad argument. It's actually a ad hominem fallacy that they're going to
Mm.
attack your character rather than attacking your position. And yet, it is still something that comes up all the time, and it's something that people see as a legitimate, for whatever reason, as a legitimate objection to the pro-life position. And so, I mean, I guess there are two ways that you could handle that objection. One way is to try to convince a person that they're thinking fallaciously, which is not always easy. Another one is just to make it a non-issue. Now, it sounds bad when I say it that way because I didn't foster just as a way to
Yeah,
avoid this
sure.
objection in a debate. That would be pretty
Ridiculous. Yeah.
outrageously petty. Um, but I think that probably did get me thinking more seriously about the topic of fostering generally. And then, you read through the scriptures and you see just time and time again God's heart for the fatherless and for the
Mm-hmm.
widow, and it just seems to be such an incredibly central part of the Christian experience that you care for these people who don't have other people to care for themselves.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah,
No, and I think, if I was to kind of rephrase that, because I might have done a poor job of kind of connecting those two issues, what I would say is that the belief that life is precious, in my understanding, led you and Nancy to decide that fostering was important. And I think the belief that life is precious comes from those conversations that we are supposed to care for the widows, for the fatherless. We're supposed to care for those who are in prison. We're supposed to care for those who are hungry, who are thirsty,
yeah, I think that's fair.
and who are sick. And I think it's easy to make it an academic issue, and it's much more respectable to make it a personal issue.
Hmm.
And so I know that's something that I respect about you, is that you care about little kids enough that you would open your home to them.
Well, I guess maybe something I would say on that is it's easy. It seems to be easy for people to separate more practical issues from more philosophical or even theological issues, and almost have like this what I do in my day-to-day life versus the things that I on paper believe. Um, and I didn't want to be that kind of person. I believe that God is real the same way that I believe that grass is green.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that human beings are valuable the same way that I believe that I'm in Jacksonville, Florida right now. So
Hmm.
these are just things that I believe are true about reality. And if I claim to think that something is true, I think that that ought to show up in the way that I interact with the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about um, on the philosophy end of things. How would you explain uh, kind of what philosophy is to someone who doesn't know it, hasn't really thought through it? Like, is there, for lack of a better expression, an elevator pitch for philosophy? Like, this is what philosophy is meant to, it's what it's encompassed by, it's what it's meant to accomplish. What is it that you're trying to impart to a student when you, for instance, teach in a worldview class, or
Mm.
you're teaching a logic class? I mean, what are those? I know those are all elements of philosophy, and so tell me, like, what's that in your mind? What's the contribution that philosophy is making to someone's life?
Yeah, so this is in philosophical circles one of the most hotly debated questions you can have is just what even is philosophy? Um, One of my favorite philosophers, Alvin Plantinga, defined it simply as thinking really hard about stuff, which honestly is a pretty good definition, but I think we could maybe break it down a little bit more to paint a more vivid picture. Philosophy as a discipline tries to look at what you could call the big questions of reality. So, why is there something rather than nothing?
Hmm.
Um, Questions about what existence actually involves. Like, what does it mean to exist? What sorts of things do exist? Uh, these would be considered metaphysical questions, questions about the nature of reality itself. It also deals with questions about knowledge. So, how do I know anything at all? How is my mind connected up to the world? Those are very important, very foundational philosophical questions. It also deals with the nature of reasoning. That's the discipline of logic. So, what counts as a good reason for some? What counts as a good argument? And then other questions of value, such as aesthetic value, like what makes a thing beautiful, or eh, very importantly, ethical questions, which some people see as really the culmination of philosophy. Um, what does it mean to be a good person? How ought I to live? What should be?
Hmm.
So those are kind of broad areas of philosophy and some of the questions that it tries to answer.
Now, I noticed you, and I'm not sure if this was just if this is an omission of intent, or just, we're in a stream of consciousness here, but you didn't talk necessarily about epistemology. Was that because you think that fits in one of those categories, or?
Yeah, I think that epistemological questions were some of the ones that I was getting at when I talked about how does our mind connect up to reality? Like, how do
Mm.
I come to know about the world? So, epistemology is the study of knowledge. Questions about like answering skeptics who say that you can't know anything about reality. Those would be epistemological questions.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Would you, and just, this may be out of left field, so don't be alarmed if you, it's a loaded question, but it would seem to me like philosophy would be kind of important as we're looking at AI right now. Do you think that there's I mean, I'm familiar with concepts like the philosophy of mind and things like that. I mean, do those have a role in the current dialogues that are going on with, what artificial intelligence is, and what it should be, and things like
Well, if you ask a philosopher if philosophy has a role in anything, we're going to tell you yes. Uh,
that?
we like to think that we're pretty important. But philosophy does touch on the AI questions in important ways. I mean, obviously, we're dealing with a lot of ethical questions
Hmm.
as AI is, kind of coming to fruition across society. It also raises a lot of theoretical questions about what it means for something to be conscious or sentient, right? So is there a level of sophistication that an AI system has to reach before it becomes a conscious being, or before it has a certain kind of moral value that we would ascribe to human beings, for example, in virtue of being rational agents?
Mhm.
Yeah, so I don't, we probably don't want to get too much down that.
No, and I think though that it's interesting that sometimes people think of artificial intelligence purely in terms of technology, or they think of consciousness purely in terms of biology. But really, when we're talking about the soul, the mind,
Mhm.
things like that, you have wandered into the heart of the of the philosophy departments there. And I don't know that you, and this may just be because I'm ignorant of the amount of stuff that's coming out about it, but I don't know that there's a general recognition that it is a topic that's important in philosophy. And so I think you have a lot of, like if someone was to say, well, you should go work on artificial intelligence will be the next big thing, so you want to get a career in artificial intelligence or something like that, what are they talking about? And typically they're thinking, oh, okay, that means I need to go learn how to program computers. They may not be thinking about, okay, well, no, I need to know how human beings think. I need to know what what the mind is, what it constitutes, and so there's roles for that in this upcoming AI
Yeah,
revolution.
it is actually a very lively field. Philosophy of AI is definitely something that is really taking off right now. In fact, if you can publish a good paper in that space right now, you will get an enormous amount of citations. So it's actually, there's a lot of incentive for philosophers to put out work on that
Well, and I
question.
think it's also important to note that a lot of times the engineers don't necessarily ask the questions of should they do something. They more just ask the question of can they do something, and a philosopher, really should be coming at it from an ethical standpoint of is this something we should be doing. So um, let's see. So Keith, we've touched on a lot of stuff. Tell me a little bit about how would you define flourishing? Because I know that not only is there a practical, and when I say practical, that's a terrible word, is there a pragmatic use of philosophy in just about every field, but there's also a principled use of philosophy in day-to-day living and the meaning of the word, the love of wisdom. Um, tell me how that kind of fleshes out, uh, how it should flesh out in terms of an individual flourishing.
So the concept of flourishing goes back a very long way, really back to the ancient Greeks. And Aristotle is quite famous for really formalizing a type of ethics that's often called eudaimonistic ethics. Eudaimonia is a word that is commonly translated into flourishing in English, and it's the idea on this Aristotelian picture of ethics is that the end point of ethics was to bring about a person's flourishing,
Mm.
that they were going to be a eudaimon. Um, and we don't need to, I think, do all of Aristotle's ethics. I don't think I would be capable of doing that in this conversation. However, um, I think that it's a really good question to just ask. Well, what does it mean for something to flourish? And I think that one pretty good answer to that question is that a thing flourishes when it fulfills its design, when it is as it was designed to be. So you could take a chair, for example, or yeah, let's take a chair. You think a chair is designed to support somebody sitting on it, right? Or maybe
Hmm.
it's designed for multiple reasons to support somebody and to look nice, uh, and all these different things. Um, and you might think that a chair that has a big gash on it doesn't look nice anymore, and that's not a good chair,
Mm.
right? And so, in that sense, the chair doesn't seem to be flourishing, right? In order for it to be the best that it could be, it would need to be reupholstered or something. Or likewise, if a chair had a bad leg and if you sat on it, it would topple over or crack underneath you. Well, it's also not able to fulfill the reason for which it was created. And so, likewise, it seems like, maybe that's not a flourishing chair. anymore. And so I think one way to answer the question of what is flourishing is just that a person or a thing or whatever we're talking about is flourishing if it is as it was designed to be. Now, that immediately, so that's sort of an answer to an ethical question, right? What does it mean to live the good life? Well, it means that you live as you were designed to be. But that immediately raises a metaphysical question, a question about the nature of reality. Namely, well, were humans designed to be anything? Were they designed to be any particular way?
Hmm.
And obviously, different worldviews are going to have different responses to that kind of question. Uh, if you're an existentialist, for example, you might say, well, every person just decides what their own life is going to be about. They determine the end of their life, and so they determine what counts as flourishing for themselves. Whereas, obviously, if you have a more theistic picture where you believe that man was created in God's image and was created to, for example, have dominion over the earth and all these different things, well, then you've got a prescribed form of flourishing, a prescribed end
Mm-hmm.
for what a human life ought to look like. And so there's actually what you could think of as a transcendent aim for your life. This isn't something that you've come up with yourself, but there's actually a goal for your
Mm-hmm.
life, and by accomplishing that goal, by fulfilling that design, you can become eudaimon. You can flourish.
Hmm. No, that is interesting. In fact, I think you would see that probably just about every uh, movie or inspirational story or something has that at the root of it, that someone is in search of what their kind of purpose is that they're trying to fulfill, and it's not until they can get to that fulfillment that they're and fulfill that purpose that they're actually going to find happiness and joy in their lives. And I think there's probably that's an appetite that's divine in its nature, that's put into us, that we're going to search out what our purpose is, and that God is the author of that purpose. And
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most common questions I think almost everyone has to answer this question at some point is, what is the meaning of life? I mean, I hope that most people think about that question at some point. Now, they might not dwell on it, right? But it seems like a meaningful question. It seems like this is the sort of question that might have an answer. Well, some worldviews are going to be able to make sense of that fact, and some might not be able to do that as well.
well, anyway, I think it's also fair to say that um, what is it? An unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, that was really what he was getting at. There was this ocean of, hey, um, just having an answer to that question that you get from somebody and saying, okay, is not really you understanding the importance of even that question. It is important to understand that we have a purpose, that we are made unique, that God values us as individuals. At the same time that He's also saying, I want to have a relationship with you, and as that individual. And I think that all of that is, unfortunately, if you're not asking that question, or if you think you've already answered it and you're answering it so you can get on to other things, you've missed the point that is the other things. Um, Keith, I'd be curious about your perspective on this concept, because there's been a few individuals that I've met who I would say fit the description of the word polymath. Now, that and in fact, I think I sent you a birthday greetings one time, and it's just something that said, like, to my favorite polymath. And I think the while I wouldn't say that you're an expert on all fields, I have found that you're entirely curious about all fields. And like, we can have conversations that really run the gambit, whether it's talking about a magic trick or talking about a book that we've read, or an interview, or a funny meme or something. There's a tremendous amount of curiosity that I've seen. and that's not normal. In my life, it's probably been restricted to probably 5 or 6 individuals, but I am, well, for lack of a better word, curious about what how you view um, the happenings that occur in life in relationship to, uh, you know, is this a like do you view that life should have a plan and everything should be sketched out and you should be working that plan, or are you thinking more along the lines of like a Forrest Gump of you're just floating around and things are happening? I like kind of talk to me about, because I do know that there are just tons of topics that you and I have had conversations about, and you seem to have a real appetite for just about all of them. So talk to me a little bit about, and also I think that's germane to the whole philosophy thing, because philosophy is useful on just about all of those.
So I I want to make sure I understand the question that you're asking me.
Mm-hmm.
I I understand that you called me a polymath, which I think is just code for nerd, and that I read about weird stuff and I do magic tricks. Uh,
That's a harsh way of putting it, but
so, are you asking me if I see a unified vision for?
more what's behind the curiosity. Like, what do you think? I mean, is it just? Do you think that the philosophy applies to everything?
Mm,
Because I mean, you were probably into a lot of stuff before that, and it seems like everything that we come to now, we kind of come to, and there's this new toolbox of things that you can apply to it.
yeah. So I think that I think that a lot of it probably does have to do with my upbringing. So I mentioned before that I was raised as a missionary kid in Germany. My parents were actually uh, they are missionaries to a predominantly well, there's a large American military community where they're from,
Mm-hmm.
and so um, the church that they're a part of is made up mostly of American military and their families. And that's the community that I grew up in. So I was in Germany, but in a very Americanized portion of Germany with a lot of American people around. And so I was at this kind of intersection of very different cultures. Um, and I think that growing up in that kind of environment, um, it probably forced me to ask some questions about the ways things are done that other people might not have to think through. Um, often if you grow up in a culture and you do things that your culture does, you don't think about the fact that you're doing it because your culture does it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when you grow up in an environment where there is no one culture, it's not as easy to do that sort of thing. So, it might be that some things are done in the American military culture that would just be completely strange to a German culture or vice versa. And I think that that probably had something to do with the way that I thought through things. Um, and I think that just questioning, well, what's the relationship between doing things because that's sort of what's done culturally, and my own Christian experience. I think that that probably started getting me thinking
Mm-hmm.
a little bit more carefully about some things. So, I understand that this is something that we do in church. So you could take some rule that is in place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, well, I want to know, is that just something that we're doing because that's what we've always done? Or is there something in the Bible that God told us, you ought not to do this thing or you ought to do that thing? And so it really raised a lot of questions for me about the relationship between my own Christian life and tradition. And I started paying very close attention to that in my teenage years and trying to figure out what was going on under the scenes, or behind the scenes rather. And I think that that probably just started me examining a lot of things more closely.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to figure out, like, well, okay, this is a practice. Why is that practice done the way it's done? Is there any real reason for that, or are we just doing it because? So,
Well, and I think also I've noticed there's an appreciation for nuance that you have. So, if I was to say, yeah, a doner kebab is the same thing as a gyro, you would take issue with that because there are nuances to a doner
I think
kebab.
anybody who knows what that is would know that that is no mere nuance. Um, you're just trying to desecrate my upbringing right now. For
Well,
those who are listening, a doner kebab is a German street food that is really God-given as far as I'm concerned.
and not immediately replaceable by a gyro.
That's correct.
So that is, yeah. Keith, we've known each other for a long time. I feel like trying to introduce you to an audience, as much as I know about you, is very difficult. I feel like I've done a very inadequate job of that. But I would say this, that I tremendously appreciate what you invest into the college and what you brought to the college, not only as a student, but also, now as a professor. And we didn't even get into talking about your experiences at the University of Florida, where you're currently pursuing your doctorate in philosophy. But I do know that we have limitations on time, and I want to be respectful of your time. And is there anything that you think we've left unsaid that needs to? Here's what I would say: is you're the perfect person to interview all of these people because you are curious, you are thoughtful, and I think you're going to do a great job with the TBC podcasts. And I think you've already been doing a great job with it. So.
Oh, thank you very much, Matt. I hope that we've left plenty unsaid so that we can have
come
more
back
good
and do
episodes.
another one. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for letting me interview you.
Thank you.